Morning. Thanks for letting me talk. I had fun preparing this talk. I've been working on it for about just 3 weeks. Of course, I saw the film Cowspiracy for the first time about 3 years ago. And that's what prompted this talk. I said I wanted to debunk Cowspiracy, but I wasn't sure how to do it directly. So 3 weeks of research has resulted in this talk, which has 26 slides and takes about 35 minutes. So at the end of the talk, we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And when I was talking to people about this during my research period, I found there's lots of discussion about eating, because everybody has their own opinions about their diet. In debunking Cowspiracy, by the way, let's switch over to the presentation. So Cowspiracy advances the idea that most of our greenhouse gases come from animal agriculture. At first that seems like an outrageous claim, and I'm used to food faddists making outrageous claims. And I'm also used to conspiracy theorists making outrageous claims. But after watching the documentary, I couldn't debunk it without more research. And so preparing for this talk gave me a chance to do that research. As you can see from this picture, I'm a lifelong meat eater. I happened to be in St. Louis 2 weeks ago, and the pork producers were having a street fair, and they really know how to make a barbecued pork sandwich. It was very tasty. Yeah. So to begin with, I realize that many of you haven't seen Cowspiracy. It's a 90-minute documentary that was released in 2014, and it's currently free on YouTube and Amazon Prime, and it's also on Netflix. So I've selected a 1-minute segment of it that summarizes the main thesis of the movie. Here's the summary. I think I have to.
To feed a person on an all plant-based vegan diet for a year requires just 1/6 of an acre of land. To feed that same person on a vegetarian diet that includes eggs and dairy requires 3 times as much land. To feed an average U.S. citizen's high-consumption diet of meat, dairy, and eggs requires 18 times as much land. This is because you can produce 37,000 pounds of vegetables on 1.5 acres, but only 375 pounds of meat on that same plot of land. I also learned the comparison doesn't end with land use. A vegan diet produces half as much CO2 as an American omnivore, uses 1/11th the amount of fossil fuels, 1/13th the amount of water, and 1/18th of the amount of land. After adding this all up, I realized I had the choice every single day to save over 1,100 gallons of water, 45 pounds of grain, 30 square feet of forested land, the equivalent of 20 pounds of CO2, and 1 animal's life, every single day.
Okay, that's the 1-minute summary. So you see that most of their claims are about the environmental cost of eating meat, which is what most of this talk is going to be about. But well, the main part of the talk is whether the Cowspiracy claims are true or whether they're hyperbole. But right away, I'm going to debunk one of their claims, the idea that not eating meat saves an animal's life. It's just not true. If you don't eat meat, a farmer will never grow the animal, so it won't exist. And you can't save something that doesn't exist. But as I was investigating why people are vegetarian, I found that most people didn't decide for environmental reasons. The next few slides show the three main reasons that people currently are vegetarian, have decided whether eating meat is good or bad. Now, it seems like the most common reason is that people don't want to hurt animals. And certainly the billion Hindus in the world are vegetarian because they don't want to kill cows. In general, they eat some meat, but not cows. Only about 2% of Americans are vegetarian. So 98% of us like our meat. And when I've talked to American vegans, most of them gave the don't hurt animals reason. The next slide shows some of the people that espouse this viewpoint. So the first thing to notice about these people is that they're all actors. To me, it seems like more than 2% of Hollywood is vegetarian. So my theory is that actors are very good at empathizing with people, and this carries over to animals. I personally like people with a lot of empathy, but I don't think this is a very good reason not to eat meat. After all, we still walk down the street and step on ants. No. Also, when we eat a carrot, we actually kill the carrot right in our mouths. So the usual response is that farm animals have sentience, whereas ants and carrots do not. Sentience is an invisible spirit that some living things have, but not others. And I'm not very happy at believing at invisible spirits. You may know that. But as a humanist, I prefer a scientific reason not to eat meat. But still, I realize that the don't hurt animals method is very effective, as the next slide shows. And you can see the bottom line on this graph of per capita meat consumption is India, which is mostly populated with Hindus. They eat less than 10% of what Americans eat. Now, but the next lowest is Kenya, which is low presumably because they can't afford to eat meat. And you can see that China and Brazil have been rising rapidly in the last 30 years, presumably because they're getting richer and they can afford meat. Now the graph shows the United States dipping in the last 10 years. But the graph doesn't include chicken. When you add in chicken, our meat consumption is about flat. Now, the next slide shows the United States consumption over a longer period of time. And you can see that in 1909, we were down at 10 pounds per person per year, and now we're up to 270 pounds per person per year. It's just huge. And most of the growth occurred in the 40s when we were getting much richer. And that leads to my next reason for not eating meat, or eating it. The next slide. So people eat meat because they can afford it. In fact, this is why I became a meat eater. My dad enjoyed the fact that he could afford to have steaks on Sunday and hamburgers on the other days of the week. And if we had guests over, we wouldn't dream of serving them vegetables. We had to honor them and celebrate our affluence. And my mom thought that meat was needed to grow big muscles and strong bodies. I call that the male corollary. Eating meat is good because it makes you look manly. And that's what Arnold Schwarzenegger is showing here in a 1970s photograph. So the idea that meat makes you manly wasn't debunked until about 15 years ago, and the next slide shows some of the people that debunked it. So these two muscle men are world-class weightlifters, and they only eat plants. What's his name? Patrick Baboumian and Kendrick Ferris. There are dozens of vegans in the NFL, but Tom Brady is the most famous, and his wife Giselle is also a vegan. Martina Navratilova is a longtime vegan, and this current Wimbledon champion, whose name I can't pronounce, is a vegan.
Never heard of.
Now, interestingly, about 5 years ago or so, Arnold Schwarzenegger became what he calls a 99% vegan. Arnold is my age, and he had he had some heart surgeries, which is the lead-in to this next reason that people don't eat meat. So most people don't eat meat for health reasons. And this is the first statistic slide. It shows the results of a study done by the American Diabetes Association, and the study group was Seventh-day Adventists who don't smoke or drink. However, many of them eat meat and some of them don't. So you have a perfect study group. And so they divided the Adventists into non-vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, and vegan. And pesco means eating fish, and lacto-ovo means eating eggs and dairy. And you get basically a progression that says the less meat you eat, the less diabetes, plus the less meat you eat, the thinner you are. Now, this study was reproduced in Europe by another group on another set of people, so it is reproducible. They had approximately the same results. But do you see the problem with it, though? The problem is that with epidemiology studies, you can only show correlation. You can't show causation. So it doesn't show that eating meat causes diabetes. Instead, it shows that people that eat meat tend to get diabetes, but it could be that there are other things that are happening. For instance, vegans could be more careful about their health in general. So that's one of the big issues with nutrition research in general. In most cases, you can't perform a double-blind, placebo-controlled test. And it leads to many situations where the theory might be shown to be plausible, but not proven. Remember that we live, though, in the real world, and we can't wait for the final proven results to come in. And so the next slide shows people that needed to improve their health now, and they acted on the information that we have. So as you might remember, Bill Clinton enjoyed his McDonald's when he was in office. But after leaving office, he had heart problems, and he became a vegan to lose weight and to improve his health. Similarly, Albert Einstein enjoyed his sausage as a youth, but he became a vegan when he got older as his health deteriorated. Venus Williams has some congenital health issue, and she became a vegan to improve her health. Her sister Serena followed a few years later. Now, Ben Franklin wrote down at age 16 why he became a vegetarian. He said it improved his health, but it was Ben Franklin, so he also said it saves money. So, later in his life, he did eat some fish. And you may remember the overweight movie producer Kevin Smith. His before and after pictures are on the next slide, which shows another aspect of the health effects of eating meat. So you can see that Kevin lost a huge amount of weight, and he's now spokesman for the vegan diet. But this slide really focuses on another aspect of meat consumption. Now, farm animals are fed about 80% of the antibiotics used in the United States. That makes them gain about 3% more weight. So the farmers end up with a product that they can sell at a lower price. The downside of antibiotics is that the animals provide an incubator for evolving diseases that don't respond to antibiotics. Collectively, those diseases are called antimicrobial resistant infections, AMR infections, and the CDC says that they cause about 23,000 deaths per year, and a great many more people just that are sick. According to the CDC, the worst killers are C. difficile and MRSA, but you may know that there are now killer versions of E. coli and Salmonella. So the basic problem is that animals are much closer to humans than plants. And that means that diseases that exist in the animal population can easily make a jump into the human population. That happened recently with the SARS disease, which was breeding in chickens, and the flu will breed in pigs or chickens. Ebola is believed to have come from people eating fruit bats, and HIV came from people eating monkeys. So that's the part of the talk that covers the older reasons why people don't do or don't eat meat. The next slide starts with the reasons highlighted in Cowspiracy. So this is a NASA picture showing the 2019 fires in the Amazon forest. The fires were mostly set by humans to clear land to graze animals or to raise crops for animal feed. So animal agriculture uses huge amounts of land and water. The Amazon has the water, but they needed land in order to raise the animals. Now, in the 1800s, American settlers did the same thing with our American forests. And this next slide shows how Americans use our land today. And you can see that the largest single use of American land is cow pasture. And of the land used for growing crops, the largest single use is, the largest use is for soybeans, corn, and hay for farm animals. And only 3% of our land is actually used to grow crops that we eat directly. And the next slide shows some of the people that became vegan because of the environmental harm to farm animals, not to farm animals. So James Cameron and Paul McCartney are two of the leaders of the Meatless Monday campaign. And Paul McCartney is now 80 years old, and he became a vegetarian in the 60s. And all of the Beatles became vegetarians in the 60s also. Leonardo DiCaprio is one of the producers of the Cowspiracy documentary. Brad Pitt is vegan, but Angelina Jolie is not. Cory Booker became a vegan for environmental reasons. Now, Al Gore went vegan about 5 years ago, but he never officially said why. Everyone's presuming that it was for environmental reasons. So individual decisions represent one type of evidence, but what do the institutions say about environmental effects of agriculture? That's what the next slide is, animal agriculture. And so environmental organizations Greenpeace and Sierra Club are notably quiet about the animal agriculture part of global warming. They like to blame the fossil fuel industry for most of the problem. In 2006, the United Nations issued a 400-page book on animal agriculture called Livestock's Long Shadow. And that book is where they published the 18% number. And in 2012, they revised that number to 14.5%.
I'm sorry, what's the percent of what?
Oh, percent of all greenhouse gases that come from animal agriculture, yeah, worldwide in this case. The EPA is in the United States only. So anyway, they switched from 18% to 14.5%. Some environmentalists say that they caved to pressure from the meat industry. I didn't have time to investigate it completely. Now, the Cowspiracy site, the Cowspiracy video actually cites the United Nations study, but it says that the United Nations left out a lot of stuff. When you add that stuff in, you get a number much larger than what the UN calculated. The stuff they left out was land usage, water usage, and the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere. And finally, the EPA says that just 9% comes from all agriculture, and since animal agriculture is just a portion, less than 9% comes from animal agriculture. So let's begin by looking a little bit at the EPA figures. So this is how they break it down. They say that transportation and electricity are the biggest producers of greenhouse gases. They actually don't devote a lot of space in their report for farm animals. And so I have a feeling that they didn't think about it too much, but based on the amount of effort the UN put in, I tend to trust their results a little bit more, but rather than dissect the EPA findings, I'll just go on. So like I say, in 2006, the EPA issued this huge book called Livestock's Long Shadow. Not only did they say that 18% of greenhouse gases, anthropogenic greenhouse gases, come from livestock, but they said that more than half that, or that's more than the amount that comes from transportation. And as the story goes, in 2012, they yielded to the meat industry and revised the number to 14.5%. You must always remember that the meat industry is huge and it will protect its interests. Also, note that the UN says that much of the greenhouse gases don't come out as CO2. The methane, nitrous oxide, and ammonia listed here are much more powerful than CO2, but they also last for a much shorter time in the atmosphere. And that time is difficult to measure. Some say that methane lasts for 10 years, and some say 30 years. And that factor of 3 can be a big reason that you end up with different numbers. Now, you're probably all familiar with the plots of CO2 in our atmosphere. In case you aren't, here's the famous plot. This was made famous in Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. Today, there are many labs around the world that measure CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. This data is from the lab on top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. CO2 tends to mix well with the atmosphere, but methane, which is also a significant greenhouse gas, and its concentrations are rising as shown on the next slide. But with methane, the effect is more complicated. Its concentration varies more around the world because it degrades. So sometimes you don't know whether it's coming from leaking natural gas wells, you don't know if it's coming from rotting tundra, and you don't know if it's coming from farmed animals. So I'm going to continue with another way of analyzing this problem. Just how many animals are there? These are USDA numbers, so they're fairly accurate. There's a huge number of cows, and the USDA breaks out calves as a separate item. I'm not quite sure why. A goodly number of dairy cows, which I think they last 6 years. So I'm going to go and analyze some of these numbers from a slightly different viewpoint. Note that chickens, there's a huge number of chickens. But, well, I'll get into that with the next slides. So this is a feedlot for cows. Cows spend some of their time in pasture, but most of their life is in feedlots. There's about 1 cow for every 3 Americans. So for the people in this room, that would be about 8 cows are on farms somewhere in America. The cows eat corn, soybeans, and hay grown on farms and trucked in. They eat a lot, and they grow to an average of 1,300 pounds in just 18 months when they're slaughtered. All the cows together produce about 10 times more manure than all the humans. As the manure decomposes, it releases CO2 and methane, and that's where most of the greenhouse gases come from. People like to giggle and say that the gases come from cow farts, but most come from the food after it's passed through the animal. Farmers try to capture the methane and sell it as biogas to be burned for fuel, and the state of California will actually pay them with environmental credits for doing that. Otherwise, the manure is sold to organic farmers that use it as fertilizer instead of fertilizers made from air and natural gas. As you might expect, rain washes some of the fertilizer off the farms and feeding lots and into rivers. And that runoff drains to the sea and causes another problem that's on the next slide. So most of the rivers that drain wet farmlands have dead zones where they enter the ocean. The most famous one is at the mouth of the Mississippi. Its dead zone is about 1,900 square miles currently. So the next slide is similar data for chickens. So right now there are about 5 chickens alive for each human in the United States. Or for this room, it's 125 to 150 chickens on some farm somewhere. Chickens grow amazingly fast, and they reach the 4-pound market weight in just 47 days. That means that a farmer gets 8 generations per year, and so each year we slaughter about 9 billion chickens in the U.S. So chickens are small, but the biomass of 9 billion of them is similar to cows, and the amount of manure they produce is also similar. Now let's go on to pigs. So bacon isn't quite as popular as beef, so there are fewer pigs than cows. Still, for the people in this room, there are about 7 pigs on farms somewhere in America, and they reach market weight of 250 pounds in just 6 months. So just imagine if the animals we eat were in this room, there'd be 3 cows, 7 pigs, 125 chickens just to support us. And that brings up the point that a lot of Americans depend on their living from raising animals. If people stopped eating meat, a lot of people would be out of work. And you can get a feel for how important animals are to farmers from the following slide. This is a slide of the corn crop, which is by far the largest farm crop. You can see that 20 years ago, about 70% of the crop was used for animal feed. But in the last 20 years, this yellow section has grown and is now the largest section. The yellow section is the corn that's used for making ethanol that we put in our gas tanks. But the blue section is for animal feed. It's still significant. The red section is the corn that we eat directly, as high fructose corn syrup or corn on the cob. So coming back to the main topic of the talk, how bad is eating meat? Using the UN's numbers, people have produced charts that try to quantify the question. Here's one way of doing it. So it shows that a high meat American diet produces 15.9 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, and a vegan diet produces 6.4. So switching to vegan cuts your carbon footprint by more than 50%. So I had 3 weeks to prepare for this talk, and I can't say if the number is 50%, 60%, or 40%, but I have a sense that it's large. It's definitely more than 30%. And I have also a sense that no one knows for sure because of things like we don't know the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere. Also, there are non-quantifiable items like land usage and water usage. But I think there's a better way of looking at the problem of how bad is eating meat, and that's shown on the next slide. So this graph attempts to compare activities that you could do to reduce your carbon footprint. There's the source for it, by the way, at the bottom. You see that switching from a gas to electric car would save 1.2 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. However, switching from an omnivore to a vegan would save 0.9 tons of CO2 per year. Well, the difference is that cars cost money, whereas switching to a vegan diet doesn't cost anything. In fact, being vegan probably saves money, and it probably improves your health. But what you do give up is the culture that your parents taught you. So many people hang on to that culture harder than they hang on to their money. I think it's an interesting way to think about your choices. Of course, these numbers need to be examined, and you can go to the original papers to check the assumptions that were made in producing the graphs. As with many social changes, you know there's something going on when Wall Street starts throwing money at it. And the next slide shows that happening. So this year's most successful IPO was Beyond Beef. It went public at $66 a share, and it's currently more than doubled. The day that this slide was made, McDonald's had announced that they're testing a Beyond Meat burger in Canada. Wendy's already has an Impossible Burger on their menu. Finally, the people in this room, I suspect are rational environmentalists and probably mostly meat eaters, but I'm not absolutely sure. But based on how I see us eating, we're mostly meat eaters. So the next slide shows what happens when a rational environmentalist is confronted with this information. I use for my example Hank Green, because he's a famous guy. He has hundreds of millions of YouTube views. He's a meat eater living in Montana, and he made this YouTube video that discusses why vegetarians are so annoying. They keep pointing out that just how much greenhouse gas he's producing with his meat habit. Now, Hank knows they're right, but he grew up eating meat, and he lives in Montana. So this is what Al Gore called an inconvenient truth. Thank you. That's my talk. And
I found the EPA figure of 9% suspiciously low. Was that this came out since Trump's EPA chief Andrew Wheeler eviscerated the stats?
I did find people that debunked the EPA 9% number, but they were people that ran vegan channels on YouTube, and so they could be food faddist. And I tried not to just copy what food faddists said, although I certainly am influenced by them.
My granddaughter became vegetarian, maybe a year ago, and so we have been inspired to go at least one day a week vegetarian. It's actually been fun to come up with new recipes, and some of them are really delicious. We have a couple of the recipes on the back table, and several of us have brought vegetarian food today, so hope you'll enjoy it. We have a pledge back there if you'd be willing to sign it, just to consider going meatless one day a week. And it's kind of fun to do it Monday because you can talk about it with a lot of people. But if you can't do it Monday, do it Tuesday, and hopefully you'll go even more days than one.
So I should announce too, I'm a lifelong meat eater, but maybe because of this talk, I've been vegan for 3 days now.
Veggie Grill at the San Antonio Shopping Center, which is a great place to eat, has all kinds of interesting offerings, and they have the Impossible Burger there, if you're a burger person, and it's not bad. And, you know, yeah. I'm not a beef eater, so I don't miss it, but my son likes it.
Yeah, I did interview one Hindu guy because I wanted to find out if he craves meat. He's living in the U.S. now, and he says he doesn't crave meat. And he grew up without it. It's purely cultural as to whether you like meat or not.
Remember, I'm getting to people in the order their hands went up, so I'm going to walk by you.
That's close enough. Okay. Hi, Jeff. This is Kakoli. I actually grew up in India, and we grew up not eating beef. And so I obviously, I don't miss it because I didn't grow up eating beef. So, but what I find really interesting in your talk is the fact that what I consider to be a very reasonable diet growing up actually has been shown now to be a very sustainable one. We ate largely vegetarian food. Occasionally we ate goat, which I hated, so I stayed away from it. I do eat meat, but in very small quantities. But my question is really about some of the figures. I find it very interesting and somewhat problematic from a measurement perspective that transportation, that people are somehow not concerned about the impact of transportation. There are over 300 million vehicles in the United States alone. And many of them are SUVs, many of them are trucks, many of them are long-distance trucks. And it seems incredible to me that the greenhouse impact of that would be somehow questionable. That 29% is, to my mind, a very reasonable figure.
Yeah, in fact, that was my assumption coming into this, is that transportation and electricity are the main sources. And I had to think about just how many animals there are in the world in order to realize that's substantial too.
Olivia Drobny. Hi, everyone. One thing that you said that caught my attention was when having guests over, having meat was common. Recently, my family went over to a friend's house for a birthday, and we purposefully all got, or they got vegetarian, the Beyond Meat on the pizza from Amici's, and I thought that was interesting because they were purposefully kind of being vegetarian for this environmental reason. Another thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly was in Germany, the Beyond Meat product was released, and very quickly it was sold out, and they had to find a replacement for it. Germans are very, very interested in the environmental impacts of eating meat, and I think about a little more than 60% of their population has actually started to reduce their meat intake. And like, let's think about that. That's Germany. You know, that's a meat-heavy culture. Yeah, there was something else I wanted to talk about, but I don't remember at this point. So thank you guys.
I think I'm brave enough to just serve vegetables to guests now, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, just a little question. What are you eating at Thanksgiving?
By the way, we're going to be having Thanksgiving at my house like we did last year, and we will cook a regular meat turkey because unless there's overwhelming response to this, but not everyone will have to eat the meat turkey. They can eat yams or whatever.
Well,
I don't think we'll have a tofurkey.
since we're identifying options to try vegetarian or vegan diets, I wanted to recommend Veggie Grill, not Veggie Grill, but Veggie Garden, which is on El Camino, just a little bit north of Ringstorf. So give it a try. It's vegan Chinese food.
My vegan friends have been taking me to vegan restaurants, and I found that it's gotten really good.
Yeah, I think I told you when you first started that I was a vegan for 3 years, and I stopped because I eat out a lot. It drives me crazy, but I'm called a flexitarian now. You know what that means?
Here you go.
I don't want to say anything.
Oh, okay.
You were going to ask a question.
I'm getting confused now as whose hands went up. I'll see what I can do.
You know, for me, it was when I started to criticize Chinese and Vietnamese about eating dog and cats that I started to think what a hypocrite I am. I'm criticizing them for eating the dog and cat, and I am eating the other animals, and then I stopped and I feel much more better. But I wanted to also share something that I have experienced from relatives that for almost 50 years ago converted to raw vegetarian because they were very sick. They were extremely sick, and they decided to become raw vegetarian. And now they are is a couple, they are in 95 years old, and they don't have any diseases at all. Like they are still living, and no diseases, no blood pressure, no cholesterol, nothing. Very old and healthy.
Yeah. Now the oldest culture in large country in the world is Japan. Okinawa is a part of Japan, and they eat a lot of fish rather than beef. And I didn't really mention fish very much in this talk. That would have added another 15 minutes to the discussion. But fish have their own issue. They're better than cows, but they're still not as good as all vegan.
All right, so one thing that is coming to mind is I'm wondering how much of this issue is actually about eating meat and how much it is about rapid industrialization, which is allowing us to have this choice every meal that we eat. And maybe the focus should be more on how we can just create more sustainable ways to eat meat and reduce our meat intake, but not necessarily get rid of it. Because, right, I think it's unreasonable to think that everyone will be a vegan, right? So, I don't know, that's just my thoughts.
Jeff, I'm just curious. You said you were vegan for 3 days. Do you mean vegan or vegetarian?
I was actually vegan, so I was careful. No milk, no eggs. I've had eggs every day for 30 years, and so this is a real break for me. And I've had milk every day for 50 years.
Yeah, recently, the last few days, I had a conversation with a friend who says, based upon things I've done to reduce my lifestyle, I've probably saved 10 future human lives. Have you ever heard of anybody doing any arithmetic like that? I mean, after all, if you reduce your emissions, and emissions are causing deaths, and they do arithmetic on that, it's plausible.
Yeah. Let's see. Another way of... At my age, I'm finding some people that have reached my age and haven't reproduced yet. I had 2 kids, but I find perfectly happy married people at age 70 that haven't reproduced. Mm-hmm. And I tell my kids about that, and my kids haven't had kids yet. So they've basically cloned their lifestyle off on my kids and reduced the number of future kids in the world just by the fact that they're happy without kids.
One thing that really surprised me, because I was like okay with being like sort of a vegetarian, because I like cheese and ice cream and so on, although we did get off cow's milk a long time ago, but otherwise. And but then it's either a video or maybe it was online. I saw this thing about the huge number of dairy cows that are polluting the Central Valley. And I thought, oh no, you know, I can live without steaks and things, but ice cream, you know, and cheese, you know, that would be really tough.
I didn't show the plots of cheese consumption, but total milk consumption has trailed off in the U.S., but cheese consumption is going dramatically up as we learn to eat pizza and put cheese on our hamburgers. And so total dairy has increased.
I have a question. Where do eggs fit in this? Eggs are an animal.
Right. So for a long time I ate eggs and milk thinking, no, they're not sentient. They're not as bad as eating cows directly. But as the graph showed, if you do eat eggs and milk, you have more diabetes than if you are pure vegan. And your body weight will be heavier too.
I think
if you take that as a causal relationship.
We have to take into consideration the impact of religion on the food we eat. Mm-hmm. For instance, in Islam you don't eat pigs. Mm-hmm. In India you don't eat cows. And all these are religious laws enforced by the economy of the time.
Right. And I sort of wish that I could go with that, because that makes life so easy just to say that the Pope says do it this way, but a humanist has to do calculations. We have to know how much is being produced and then decide if that's good or bad for the world. And it's much more complicated than just having it written in a scripture saying don't do this.
Hi, Jeff. First of all, I want to thank you for presenting some facts and figures. It's really good to see that. There's so much information out there, and it's hard to parse it for most of us. Did you come across anything that talks about, you know, the pressures on making the meat and dairy more sustainable, in quotes, and you know, where could that lead, or is that just a kind of a false hope that, you know, as we wean ourselves off some of this stuff, how can they switch to a more sustainable, you know, version of it?
Yeah, there can be great improvements in that respect. One of them that's sort of a false hope, though, is the idea of grazing the cows on grass. It turns out that if you took them off of feedlots and put them on pastures, they would take up more land and use up more resources than putting them on feedlots. So that by itself is a false, although the cows may be healthier because they're more further apart. But there are lots of other ways that you can make incremental improvements.
I was going to comment about your 2 children, And when I was first in California, we were members of ZPG, the Zero Population Growth Office was in Los Altos. So we felt obligated to produce no more than 2. Just replace yourself if you have to, but don't go beyond that. But I was going to comment about the food because last night we had one of my favorite dinners, no meat, but it did contain some eggs. But it was a summer squash casserole with eggs and cheese, fresh green beans from the farmer's market, half of an organic avocado, and I meant to have a slice of tomato. And I'm an artist, so I don't cook very well, but I can decorate a plate, and if it's organic and fresh, it always tastes good. And that's what I think is a good goal to have when you're going to eat something. It might as well attract your attention and be pleasing to see, and it's very easy for me to eat vegetables. We were too full to add the tomato, so that was enough.
I
Okay,
did mention,
lost track. Who's next?
I don't know if I mentioned dairy in particular. It seems like it's not as bad as beef, eating beef. But a dairy cow typically lives 7 years, and she is pregnant about 6 times. She gets pregnant, and then she has a calf, and so she would produce herself 6 times in 6 years. So they have to sell the calves as veal. And the dairy cow then produces for about 9 months, and then she has to get pregnant again. So you can't really say that drinking milk isn't killing cows. But on the other hand, that wasn't one of my favorite reasons for becoming a vegan.
I just wanted to comment on your slide. It was towards the end, showing SUVs, cars, air travel. Right, that one there. Mm-hmm. Going from vegan, omnivore to vegan definitely cuts back. But look at the SUV, look at the car, look at the hybrid, look at the flight. You know, if you go to an airport, which I don't like to fly, and one of the reasons is there are so many people there. It's just overwhelming. And, you know, people have to think about changing their lifestyle, not just what they're eating, but where they're traveling and how they're driving and how they're flying.
Yep. Yeah. The fellow that talked to us a month or so ago told me that flying an airplane is equivalent to getting 75 miles per gallon in a car. So you put 200 people in an airplane, and together they average 75 miles a gallon. It's equivalent to driving.
Jeff, I came late and I haven't heard whole your conversation. Therefore, I'm asking, have you looked at the meat eater animals and the vegetable eater animals? Because human, because of the long intestine that looks like, or not look like cows and all other vegetarian, and also about our teeth that we cannot take meat and just rip that off like wolf and lions. We are a vegetarian from the biological sense of science. Did you look at that things? Did you describe it?
Not very much in this talk, but that has definitely been considered, and people like to look at the diet of gorillas and chimps and say that we probably evolved similarly.
Are you selling your article? Is it on sale?
My article?
Is your article on sale?
Would
you repeat the question, please? So have the mic.
Is your article on sale? Can we get a copy of it?
My slides, I can post them or send them to you if you give me your email. Yes. Yeah. So anyway, cows and chimps eat some meat, and that's probably how we evolved. So we probably didn't evolve entirely as vegans, but we can definitely live without meat if we have to. That's been proven. Ben Franklin lived to 84, which was pretty old for that age. Although he had fish, so it doesn't count.
So in response to your comment, one thing that came to mind was Greta Thunberg, how she, she's obviously an environmental activist, and she chose to sail across the ocean instead of fly. And I'm amazed by that. Like, she's really practicing what she preaches. But it really does make us think about, like, is that vacation worth it? Mm-hmm. I think that's a really, really wonderful, it's a holistic approach you have to take. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to stop eating meat and everything else is a go, right?
I think the point was we really have to change the way we live.
Hey, please don't talk if you don't have the mic.
One thing that didn't put too much stress on was the fact that these animals are diseased. The chickens, eggs have, they tell you to cook them really well because they have salmonella. And the reason they have to give them so many antibiotics is because they're not well. They're living a very deprived life. And that's not really something you should be eating.
Yeah, I did have a slide on that, and I do believe that that is a big reason. And the CDC does say that there are 23,000 deaths per year from microbial-resistant microbes, and a goodly amount of that could come from farmed animals.
One thing wasn't included in this, I just ran across a headline that I hadn't had time to pursue, but one of the greatest emitters of CO2 in this country is the military. And if we figured in the costs of war and production of greenhouse gases alone, I'm sure it would be disastrous.
When I was trying to decide on which electric car to buy, still haven't done it. I had an SUV and I was hauling big paintings and garden materials, and I went to all the meetings for electric cars, and they said, well, how much do you drive? And I said, well, we bought a house where we could walk everywhere and do that much of the time, but they said, well, if you don't drive your car very much, you can wait a minute. You can wait a little bit longer. So I figured I've waited too long, but I try not to drive.
Notice that this graph has lines for just giving up your car altogether, not converting to electric. That you get electric still produces some CO2 indirectly.
Okay, we still have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. One thing that you mentioned was kind of the health risks. If any of you have ever been to Europe, you may have noticed that they keep their eggs not refrigerated, but on the shelf. Mm-hmm. Sometimes their milk as well. The reason for the eggs is because they, in the United States, we wash them in a way that removes the cuticle of the egg, which is actually a protection from bacteria entering the egg. Eggshells are permeable. And so just the way that we store our food also is, it's a problematic, it's problematic for our diets, for our health.
Some years ago, the head of the agricultural department was giving the talk at Stanford, and she presented how much antibiotics is used in the animals that is raised. Mm-hmm. And it was so shocking that if anyone would have heard, would not touch any meat anywhere.
Yeah, I did do a little investigation on that. It is true that the slide showed 80% is used in farmed animals of antibiotics. Well, the government, the CDC, has issued guidelines that crack down on use of antibiotics for animals, but it's not all antibiotics, and you're still allowed to use them to keep the animals healthy, and you're still not really sure whether the farmer is following the guidelines or not.
Okay, any other questions? We have about 2 minutes to go.
Yeah. I understand that Newsom has announced that California is not going to meet its emission goals, and the reason is because people keep buying SUVs and pickups.
Yeah, about Jerry Grass. About 10 years ago, I was doing a long trip and I wanted to minimize my CO2 production, so I was looking into how much different transportation causes, and it turned out to be quite complicated. And in fact, it looked to me like 4 people in a Prius might be just about anything, and things have changed. I mean, airplanes have actually gotten better over time. So back to your point about 75 miles per gallon for planes, I'd like to know what's involved in that. And for one thing, I've heard planes, just cruising at altitude, they don't use a whole lot, but they use a lot to get up there. So there's a big difference between a plane that only makes 1 stop and one that makes 2 stops. So I don't know. I'll tell you one thing, I haven't flown since 2003.
I wondered that same question when I asked our speaker about a month ago, and he just gave me the number 75. He didn't justify it. So I just took it on face value. I haven't investigated it. I have seen engineering videos that show the bigger you make an engine, the more efficient it is. That's why jets have these giant jet engine intakes now. And the 737 MAX is way more efficient than a 737, and yet we've grounded all of our 737 MAXs.
I just have a kind of a random comment having to do with eating meat. Your earlier slide showed weight gain as a result of eating meat, and I just wanted to comment. I'm gluten-free, and I've had digestive problems all my life. Maybe I had gluten problems all my life. But at one point, my doctor said, just eliminate carbohydrates and only eat vegetables and only eat meat. And I ate more meat, and the result was I lost so much weight that my doctor told me to pour oil over everything. So I'm just saying it's not necessarily the meat, it's quantities, and it's complicated too.
When it comes to nutrition, everything is complicated. It's a big moving system.